God's plan versus my plan. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Good morning. We are going to be starting a new series of studies on the book of Matthew. Now, along the way, we will stop and look at some particular topics, but we're going to be focusing on Matthew really for quite a while. I want us to look at Matthew because it was written to the Jews by a Jew. Now, he was an embarrassment of the Jews. He was a tax collector, and that was shameful in the eyes of the Jews for a Jewish man to actually be collecting taxes for the Romans. But it was written by a Jew for the Jews, and it'll give us a chance to really investigate the Hebrew Scriptures as we look at this account of Jesus Christ. And Matthew ties his account of Jesus' life and ministry to something that the Jews would know and they would understand. He ties it to their history, to their culture, to their religious beliefs, to their holy texts, the Hebrew Scriptures. And so I think this will be a good way for us to investigate the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, as we also look at the life of Jesus. So if we look in Matthew chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Immediately, Matthew is tying this central figure that the reader of his account might not really know that much about, but he's tying this central figure, this Jesus Christ, this anointed one, to two people that the Jewish people would have clearly known about and understood. David and Abraham. He ties his account to those individuals really for a reason. And a lot of that is based on Hebrew prophecies. The Jewish people would have known about these prophecies regarding their coming Messiah. And Matthew is now going to tie this Jesus, whom he is going to declare as the Messiah, to these Hebrew prophecies about the Messiah with regards to Abraham and David. Now you may say, well, where are those prophecies found? Well, if you're talking about Abraham, one of the first places that we see that is Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. It says, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." He sort of says the same thing later on in Genesis 18, verses 17 and 18. He says, "And the Lord said, See, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him?" Now you may say, well, I don't know if that really has anything to do with Jesus. Well, Peter believed that it had to do with Jesus. We can see in Acts chapter 3, beginning in verse 24, while Peter is speaking to the Jews in the temple, he says, "All the prophets who have spoken from Samuel and those who came after him also proclaimed these days." The days that the Jews that are being spoken to right there, that were in the temple, the days that they were living in. "You are the sons of the prophets, and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant," that servant would be Jesus, "sent him to you first, to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness." So here we can see that Jesus is being tied to that very statement that is made in Genesis, where God says that through Abraham and his offspring, and Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 3, the offspring is Jesus, not the Jewish people, it's Jesus. But through Abraham and his offspring, Jesus, that all the world would be blessed. And so Matthew is starting off by tying this Messiah, this Jesus Christ, to Abraham. He also ties this Jesus Christ to David. Now, there's prophecies in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that the Messiah would be tied to David as well. We can go to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. It says, "There shall come forth a root from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit." Also in 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 12, God is speaking to David, and he says, "When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name." Solomon really did do that. He built the temple. "And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." So here, especially at the end, we're talking about not an earthly king, we're talking about an eternal king, an eternal kingdom. And so the Jewish people clearly understood that their Messiah would be coming from this lineage, starting with Abraham and then passing through David to the Messiah. And Matthew was telling the reader, this Jewish reader, pay attention. This Jesus that I am going to be declaring to you is the fulfillment of the prophecies that you have known about your whole life. Now Matthew is going to connect Jesus to some specific people in this lineage, and each of these people has a reason for being in the list. So if you continue reading in Matthew chapter 1, you can read all these people, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I am going to talk about a few of them. Matthew is preparing his reader for some really astounding information regarding this Jesus. And this information is all going to be tied to the Hebrew Scriptures. So let me give you an example. In Matthew chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, Matthew talks about Abraham. Now, there are a lot of things that they knew about Abraham and that we know as well. But the primary focus of Abraham is the covenant. Abraham was given the covenant relationship that was symbolic of the relationship that Yahweh had with his people. This was back in Genesis chapter 15. And when Matthew ties Jesus to Abraham to a Jewish reader, his or her mind would have immediately gone back to that covenant. Now remember, and we've talked about this is an odd covenant. Yahweh and the Word of Yahweh walked the blood trail instead of Yahweh and Abraham. And in essence what he is saying is that he, Yahweh, would keep his followers righteous in the covenant, but there would require a death. And somehow all of this Yahweh, Word of Yahweh individual would be the recipient of that death punishment. Now the Jewish people would never have understood how all of that was supposed to play out, but it was clear from the covenant description in Genesis chapter 15 that a death was going to be required in order for the people to stay in the relationship with Yahweh. And Matthew is telling them through this mention of Abraham, follow this whole covenant picture away in the back of your mind. By the end of the story that I am going to be telling you, you will understand that covenant and how that death that was required was actually fulfilled. Matthew then goes on and he talks about Isaac. Now, there's actually not that much in the Hebrew text about Isaac. But there is one story about Isaac that every good Jew would have remembered. And Matthew is trying to bring that story into the mind of his reader. This is where Isaac was the sacrifice that Yahweh ordered Abraham to bring to Mount Moriah. If you remember that story, the Jewish people would definitely have remembered that story. Now, Yahweh did provide another sacrifice, but it was Isaac that was the preordained sacrifice. Matthew is telling his reader that by the end of this account, there will be another preordained sacrifice that was decided ahead of time by the Father that would have to be made. And somehow this Jesus, this Christ, this anointed one, would play a part in all of this sacrifice. And the reader would not have known yet what part Jesus would play. But Matthew is masterfully tying Jesus to this story of Isaac being the sacrifice. Jacob, he talks about next. He says, he talks about Jacob being the son of Isaac. Now, the Hebrew scriptures do have a little bit more about Jacob than they do Isaac. But if you take this story as a whole, Jacob is a wayward son. And he is in this wayward condition because of his bad decisions, and has now been driven from his relationship with his father, with his family. But eventually he comes back. And how does he come back? Well, he has two interactions with Yahweh that lead him back. First, we can see in Genesis chapter 28 where Jacob has the dream, the vision of the ladder that reached from earth up into heaven. And he has this interaction with Yahweh there, Genesis 28 verse 12. He also has another interaction with Yahweh where Jacob wrestles with Yahweh, or the word of Yahweh. And here, God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. Now notice, Matthew uses the word Jacob because he's trying to get the Jewish reader to make this connection. Wait a minute, it's not Jacob, it's Israel. Yes, and because of that, he's tying these Jewish people to Jacob. He's tying the children of Israel to Jacob. Jacob being the precursor of the nation of Israel. In fact, these people would later be known as the Jews. But Jacob is the precursor. He's the one that bears the name Israel. And he dedicates himself to God where? At the ladder. You see, prior to this, he's just a wayward son. But after the vision of the ladder, everything changes. So we can see this in Genesis 28, beginning in verse 20. It's Jacob talking here. He says, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I may come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. You see, this is where Jacob commits his life to Yahweh. Now, Jacob did not live a perfect life any more than any of the rest of us do. This latter scene is where Jacob sort of begins to give up his wayward tendencies and devotes his life to Yahweh. And Matthew is foretelling his reader that he or she, whoever the reader is a part of that wayward child. And that the link back to God is the ladder. That would be the ladder that would connect the offspring of Jacob, or Israel, the children of Israel, to Yahweh. And while it may not make sense yet, by the end of the account of Jesus, the reader would know who this latter was going to actually be that would reunite the people back to the Father. But he's telling them also that it would not be like they expect. You see, none of this was going to play out like they expected these stories to play out. Matthew is bringing up these stories, and he is foretelling them that all of these stories are going to be playing out in this account, but it's not going to play out the way that you think it's going to play out. We can clearly see in four more characters this idea of things not playing out the way that the people expected with these four characters that Matthew mentions. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, he mentions Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, he says Solomon the father of Boaz by Rahab. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, he goes on to say Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 6, he says David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now, what do we have here? Well, if we look at these four women that Matthew talks about, we can see a commonality. Tamar is basically a woman who prostituted herself. Well, you can read about that in Genesis chapter 38. She sat by the road and acted as a prostitute, had a sexual relationship with Judah, and out of that relationship eventually led to the line that Jesus came from. Rahab was probably a prostitute. You may call her Rahab. She is basically the woman who helped the children of Israel as they were spying out Jericho. And she was saved from the destruction of Jericho because of her faithfulness. But she was probably a prostitute and was definitely a pagan Gentile. And you can read about her in Joshua chapter 2. Ruth, we know that she was a pagan. It says in the scriptures that she was a Moabite, and the pagans worshipped Chemosh, who was basically the god Venus. The Moabites, interestingly enough, were the offspring of the son from Lot that he begat with his daughter. So if you go back to Genesis chapter 19, you can read about this incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter, and they gave birth to a son, and this son then began the line that became the Moabites. So Ruth was part of a group of people that were pagans, they were Gentiles, they were the result of an incestuous relationship. That's Ruth. And then we have the wife of Uriah, who we actually know as Bathsheba. Matthew doesn't even mention her name. He just simply says the wife of Uriah. This is the woman that had the adulterous relationship with David. You can read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, what do we know about her? Well, we know that she was married to Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was he was part of David's military, but because he wasn't of the Hebrew people, he was a Hittite, he was probably a mercenary. It wasn't uncommon at all for kings to have mercenary soldiers, and actually they kept pretty close to them, themselves, because there really wasn't an advantage for a mercenary soldier to kill the king. As long as the mercenary received his pay on a regular basis, it's not like he was going to benefit if the king was killed. So a lot of times mercenaries were more trusted by a king than even his own people. So if he was a Hittite, Bathsheba was probably a Hittite too, living among the Jews as this mercenary family. So if she was a Hittite, she was a pagan woman, worshiping the sun goddess Arena and the storm goddess Tarhun, who was also the king of the gods in the Hittite religion. But we know that she was a pagan, we know that she was a Gentile, and we know that she was a woman that had an adulterous relationship and forever tarnished the reputation of the great King David. Think about Matthew putting these four women in this genealogy. Four outrageous, shocking women presented prominently in what is traditionally an all-male lineage. What on earth is Matthew trying to say? And before we even get into the story, we need to understand that Matthew is foreshadowing this idea that the Messiah that the people were looking for was not going to be what they expected. In fact, this Messiah would turn everything that they were expecting on its head, turning it upside down. Just as much as taking an all-male lineage and start putting in women, and not just women, but pagan women, adulterous women, women that should never even show up in the genealogy of the great Messiah. Matthew is prominently displaying these women as a way of letting the reader know what you are about to read is going to be vastly different than what you're expecting of your Messiah. You see, these Hebrew stories that you can read about in the Hebrew text, the Old Testament, were going to play out differently than what people were expecting, what they were thinking. Matthew wanted them to be prepared to see that their prophecies were going to be fulfilled, but they were going to be fulfilled in ways that they never expected. Their Messiah was going to teach and act and react in ways that they never expected. And in some ways, it was even going to be outrageous and shocking. What does all of this lineage tell us? It tells us the same thing. This morning, if you're not a follower and you're just kind of investigating this Jesus, know that this Jesus is going to act in ways that you might not expect. As we go through this book of Matthew, whatever you've heard about Jesus may not be what you actually see. He may not teach the ideas that you're really expecting. He may actually teach ideas that are outrageous and may turn what you think you know on its head. If you are a follower, then know that the one that you call Lord and Savior is different than expected. His plans were not what everyone expected at that time and even today. You see, folks, we're no different than those people were. Part of what Matthew is doing so well is telling us today that our plans are probably not going to be identical to God's plans. You see, folks, as we go back into the Hebrew Scriptures, we see that everyone that we consider giants of the faith had to set their plans aside and follow a plan that on the surface made no sense. Abraham, he has to just give up his job, give up his career, give up his friends, and go to a land that God is going to show him. And that's really all the instruction he had. Moses started off as the prince of Egypt, has his entire life ahead of him, and because of some God-orchestrated events, ends up in the desert receiving instruction from God as to how God was going to work through him to deliver his people out of Egyptian bondage. Joseph, you know Joseph, the young man with the coat of many colors. I mean, how could he possibly have expected his visions, his dreams to turn out the way that they did by passing through an Egyptian prison? Daniel, the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had their entire lives planned out. And then Babylon comes in, overthrows the kingdom of Judah, and takes those four young men back to Babylon, and they now have to live among these pagans and be faithful to Yahweh. And folks, do we think that we're any different? Today, I'm going to ask each one of us, has God uprooted our plans recently? Has He uprooted our plans ever? Are you still living out the plans that you set years ago, comfortable with what's going on in your life? What you need to take from Matthew, the first chapter, is that is not the God that you claim to serve and follow. He regularly turned people's lives upside down to accomplish His plan. At least faithful people. And we're going to see Him do this over and over as we look at this amazing account of Jesus presented by this outrageous embarrassment of a Jew named Matthew.